On October 11, 1919, a government official named J. Edgar Hoover sat in his office at the Bureau of Investigation in Washington and wrote a memo about a Jamaican immigrant living in Harlem. The memo carried a file reference, RG60, file 198940, and it said something no future documentary about Marcus Garvey would bother to put on screen. Hoover wrote that Garvey had not yet violated any federal law that would allow the government to deport him. Then, in the next line, Hoover suggested a workaround. Go after him for fraud, connect it to the Black Star Line propaganda. The memo went to Special Agent Ridgely. The strategy went into motion, and 4 years later, Marcus Garvey stood convicted of mail fraud on a single count, based on one envelope mailed to one man. The envelope was empty. That is the distance between a memo and a conviction, between a suggestion and a deportation, between the largest black mass movement of the 20th century and its collapse. And the paperwork that connects those 2 points has been sitting in the National Archives for over 100 years. Hoover needed a workaround because Marcus Garvey had not broken any law. What he had done was build something the Bureau could not ignore. Garvey arrived in Harlem in 1916, carrying an organization he had founded 2 years earlier in Jamaica called the Universal Negro Improvement Association. Within 4 years, the organization had expanded to nearly 1,000 divisions spread across multiple countries. Garvey did not build a protest movement. He built an economic machine funded entirely by black money, $5 at a time. The Negro Factories Corporation, incorporated in 1920, operated laundries, restaurants, a doll factory, and a publishing house. But the centerpiece was the Black Star Line, a shipping company designed to connect the African diaspora through commerce and eventual repatriation. The company was incorporated in June of 1919. Garvey sold stock at $5 a share. The first ship, the SS Yarmouth, a refurbished coal carrier, was running routes to Caribbean ports within 5 months. A second vessel, the SS Shadyside, sank in the Hudson River off 157th Street in New York City from an unattended leak. A third, the SS Kanawha, suffered a boiler explosion that killed a crew member. The fleet was mismanaged. The ships had been purchased at inflated prices, the routes lost money, and the cargoes went uninsured. But the money kept coming in. According to government auditors cited in the UCLA Marcus Garvey Papers introduction, roughly 153,026 shares were sold to approximately 35,000 stockholders. The total investment reached an estimated $765,130. Adjusted to 2025, using the Consumer Price Index, that number equals approximately $14.66 million. That money came from domestic workers scrubbing floors in Manhattan, laborers on factory lines in Philadelphia, and Pullman porters pressing uniforms on overnight trains. They lined up at Liberty Hall to buy $5 stock certificates printed with the Black Star Line seal. Garvey turned pocket change into a transnational shipping company, and the Bureau of Investigation watched every dollar move through the United States mail. The surveillance network around Garvey wasn't a single agency operation. According to the legal analysis published by Hobbs and Fitch in the Civil Rights Law Journal in 1991, the agencies monitoring Garvey included the American Protective League, United States Military Intelligence, British Intelligence Services, diplomatic channels, and postal inspectors. The Bureau of Investigation coordinated the entire effort. Garvey was initially flagged as a potential communist agitator during the Red Summer of 1919, when race riots burned through 24 American cities and anarchist bombs tore through government offices in Washington. But Garvey was not a communist. He was not an anarchist. He was standing on stages in Harlem in a military-style uniform with gold braiding, addressing crowds that filled city blocks. When the political labels did not stick, the Bureau shifted the classification, and the new category was Negro agitation. That label changed everything. It meant Marcus Garvey was not being investigated for a crime he had committed. He was being investigated for organizing. The crime would come later. The surveillance came first. Hoover made the strategy explicit in his October 1919 memo. Garvey had not violated any deportation statute. The memo acknowledged that fact directly, but Hoover did not recommend closing the file. He recommended building a case. The word he chose was fraud. The target he identified was the Black Star Line promotional materials, the printed stock circulars, and folded advertisements that had raised $765,000 from 35,000 Black investors. The United States mail was the financial bloodstream of the movement. Every flyer, every stock receipt, every solicitation traveled through government-operated post offices. Hoover identified that mail route as the prosecution's point of entry 3 years before an indictment ever existed. To build that case, Hoover deployed a tool no one had used before. He hired the Bureau of Investigation's first Black agent, James Wormley Jones, and embedded him inside Garvey's organization. Other informants followed. Herbert Boulin, one of Garvey's own confidants, was also reporting to the Bureau. For 3 years, these agents searched for anything that could be turned into a federal charge. They attended meetings at Liberty Hall in Harlem. They copied internal documents. They monitored Garvey's newspaper, The Negro World, which was already being confiscated and banned by colonial governments across the Caribbean. In January of 1923, 8 prominent Black leaders, including a Philip Randolph, signed a letter addressed to United States Attorney General Harry Daugherty. The letter urged the government to vigorously and speedily push its case against Marcus Garvey for using the mail to defraud. It was the culmination of a coordinated effort called the Garvey Must Go campaign. W.E.B. Du Bois had already published a detailed financial takedown of the Black Star Line in The Crisis, the official magazine of the NAACP, giving the prosecution's narrative a respected Black intellectual's stamp of approval. Garvey's own political rivals were now amplifying the prosecution from the outside, while Hoover's informants worked it from the inside. The indictment had already been filed in February of 1922, charging Garvey and 3 CO defendants with 13 counts of mail fraud. The charge centered on advertising for a 4th ship, the SS Phyllis Wheatley, named after the colonial-era poet. Promotional materials had used a photograph of the vessel with the name painted on its bow, but the Black Star Line had not completed the purchase. A leaflet showing a ship Garvey did not own, mailed to investors he was asking for more money, became the government's theory of fraud. The trial began in May of 1923 before Judge Julian Mack in a federal courtroom in New York. Garvey chose to represent himself. He sat at the defense table in a 3-piece suit with no attorney beside him. His co-defendants, Orlando Thompson, Ely Garcia, and George Tobias, had lawyers. The jury was all white. Prosecutor Maxwell Maddox struggled to prove his case because most of the Black Star Line stock had been sold at rallies and at Liberty Hall, not through the mail. A federal mail fraud charge required proof that the mail was used as part of the scheme, and the evidence for that came down to 1 witness and 1 piece of physical evidence. The witness was a 19-year-old office boy named Schuyler Cargill, who had worked for the Black Star Line. Cargill took the stand and testified that he had mailed promotional materials on behalf of the company, but under cross-examination, Cargill admitted something the judge never addressed. He said the prosecutor, Maxwell Maddox, had told him to lie. Under the perjury rules in effect in 1923, that admission should have triggered a new trial. Garvey, representing himself, did not know the procedural mechanism to force one. Judge Mack did not intervene. The physical evidence was a single envelope. It was addressed to a man named Benny Dancy, a stockholder who had purchased shares in the Black Star Line. Dancy testified that he recognized the envelope. He said it carried the Black Star Line stamp on the back. But Dancy could not remember what had been inside the envelope or whether he had even read the contents. Legal scholars later confirmed what the court record showed. The envelope was empty. No letter, no promotional material, no solicitation. One empty envelope addressed to one man became the only physical evidence connecting Marcus Garvey to a federal mail fraud scheme. The jury convicted Garvey on one count out of 13. His 3 co-defendants were found not guilty on all charges. Judge Mack sentenced Garvey to the maximum, 5 years in federal prison and a $1,000 fine. In his sentencing remarks, Mack cited the enormous extent of the scheme. The prosecutor had closed his argument by calling Garvey a tiger and asking the jury whether they would let the tiger loose. Newspaper headlines across Harlem carried the verdict the next morning. Marcus Garvey entered the federal penitentiary in Atlanta in February of 1925 after his appeal was denied. He served nearly 3 years before President Calvin Coolidge commuted his sentence. His second wife, Amy Jacques Garvey, had orchestrated a relentless letter-writing campaign from outside the prison walls and published a second volume of philosophy and opinions of Marcus Garvey to keep his ideas in circulation while the government tried to bury them. The commutation came with a condition: deportation. On December 2, 1927, Garvey was taken by train from Atlanta to the port of New Orleans. 500 supporters crowded the wharf in a driving rain on one of the coldest days of the year. Garvey stood bareheaded on the upper deck of the SS Saramacca, a ship owned by United Fruit, the same company on whose Costa Rican plantation he had worked as a young man. He delivered a farewell address to the crowd below. Then the ship pulled away from the dock. He never returned to the United States. The Universal Negro Improvement Association, without its founder, lost momentum. The nearly 1,000 divisions that had stretched across continents began to dissolve. Meeting halls that had been packed to the walls went quiet. The Black Star Line, already struggling with ships purchased at inflated prices and chronic mismanagement, was finished. The $14 million in today's money that working-class Black families had invested $5 at a time was gone. It was not because the government proved the investment was a fraud. It was because the government proved that one empty envelope had been mailed to one man in New York. Garvey spent his remaining years in Jamaica and then London, trying to rebuild what the conviction had dismantled. He spoke at Speaker's Corner in Hyde Park to whoever would listen. He organized from a small office on Beaumont Crescent in West Kensington. He petitioned for a pardon that never came during his lifetime. Marcus Garvey died in London on June 10, 1940, at the age of 52 after suffering 2 strokes. He never saw the United States again. He never saw the movement restored. In 1964, the Jamaican government exhumed his body, returned it to Kingston, and declared him the country's first national hero. His remains were placed in a marble shrine at National Heroes Park. The man the United States convicted on one count of mail fraud became the founding symbol of an independent nation. J. Edgar Hoover, the man who wrote the October 1919 memo, went on to lead the Federal Bureau of Investigation for 48 years under 8 presidents. He sat behind the same desk in the same office on Pennsylvania Avenue from the Coolidge administration to the Nixon administration. The surveillance to prosecution playbook he tested on Garvey became a template. The Bureau used variations of it against Paul Robeson, against the leadership of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and against Martin Luther King Jr. through the program it called COINTELPRO. On December 4, 1969, the same playbook reached its logical conclusion. FBI-coordinated Chicago police shot and killed 21-year-old Black Panther chairman Fred Hampton in his bed during a pre-dawn raid. Hampton had been drugged by an informant the Bureau had planted inside his own organization, the same infiltration method Hoover had pioneered with James Wormley Jones 50 years earlier. The memo that targeted Garvey was not an exception. It was a prototype. On January 19, 2025, 101 years after his conviction, Marcus Garvey received a posthumous presidential pardon from President Joe Biden on the final full day of his administration. Justin Hansford, the Howard University law professor who had spent years working on the pardon petition, received the call from the White House. He brought Julius Garvey, Marcus Garvey's 91-year-old son, into a three-way phone call to deliver the news. Hansford later said he had just borne witness to the culmination of over 101 years of effort. The pardon corrected the conviction. It did not correct the mechanism. The October 11, 1919, Memo still sits in a folder in the National Archives under file reference RG60-198940. The ink has faded, the paper has yellowed, but it still says Marcus Garvey had not violated any federal law, and it still recommends building a fraud case anyway. The pardon came 101 years late. The memo has never been retracted.